I'd like to welcome everyone once again to this month's Wildlife for Lunch webinar. Today's webinar is going to be on property evaluation basics and reading the land. It's presented by Shane Kiefer with Plateau Land and Wildlife. Today's webinar is made possible through funding provided by the San Antonio Livestock Exposition Incorporated, and it's hosted by the Texas Wildlife Association and A&M AgriLife Extension.
Want to welcome everybody here today. I'm Shane Kiefer. I'm a wildlife biologist with Plateau Land and Wildlife Management, and we work with private landowners to help them enhance and restore their land. We spend a lot of time just educating landowners about their properties or helping them evaluate properties that they may be interested in, and that's the topic for today. I'm going to talk about some of the tools and techniques that I use when visiting a property, really for the first time often, to get a sense of what's there and what the history of the property might have been. This quote's particularly appropriate for this topic. I like this one a lot. I use a lot of Aldo Leopold quotes. He's the father of wildlife management. You'll see his quotes quite a bit in these presentations. And this one, a conservationist, is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke he is writing his signature on the face of the land. This one works particularly well today because it really summarizes the message, and that is that anything that you do or that has been done on a property leaves some mark, it leaves a signature. Some of these marks are very clear and evident. Think of a recently bulldozed path. Some of them are much more subtle, harder to read. Some of them last for decades or even generations. And then some of them may disappear after a few months or a few years. And so, but every action leaves some sort of mark, some sort of signature on the land. And that's really what we're going to talk about, is how to start to tease out and read some of those signatures. So you can get a sense of what's happened. Knowing what's happened, how a property has been managed and used in the past can do a lot to inform how to manage it going forward. All right, so another way to summarize this is the story of a property is written in the vegetation and the soils. This is a before and after picture, same pasture, exact same property, left and right, separated by a little less than 10 years' time. You can see on that before side, very little vegetation other than some prickly pears and mesquite in the background. The after, very stark difference. It's a very different look, and this is pretty obvious. This change is evident. But what if you just visited the property in the after? What if you didn't see the before? If you didn't have this picture record? Is there something about this after picture, this after situation that can tell you a little bit about that before picture? And there's quite a bit, and this is that signature that's written on the land. So briefly, you can see lots of grass in that picture, as well as some weeds, some forbs. But that grass is almost completely dominated by old world bluestem, King Ranch bluestem, or maybe Kleberg bluestem in this case. This is down South Texas. And that in and of itself is an indicator of something. Those non-native grasses tend to dominate, persist in heavy grazing situations. There's lots of grass now in this after picture, but that could have been a short-term rest. It could have been maybe the cows have been off for a year or so. Maybe they've been rotated out. But the fact that there's really not a lot of other types of grass in that picture tells you something. It tells you there's probably some history of pretty heavy use. And the fact that the prickly pear is there, you can't see it as well in that after picture because it's kind of covered up by the grass. But if you were to walk that pasture, you'd see lots of little prickly pear pads scattered everywhere. And that too is an indication of some past pretty intensive use. Prickly pear tends to, like a lot of other invasive brush species, tends to become abundant in overused, overgrazed situations, or sometimes when you do something as simple as, shredding it, and it can spread. But it takes advantage of bare soil and bare spots and disturbance. And so that abundance of prickly pear out there, when you get out and actually walk it, tells you again, this pasture probably saw some pretty heavy use. Maybe it was former cropland, maybe it was heavily grazed, but it tells you that there was some pretty intensive use on this site beforehand. So even if you don't have this before picture, there's a bit of there's some memory there in the vegetation, and that's really what we're talking about today. So what kind of tools are available to you? These are some of the common ones that I use, the most basic ones that anybody can take advantage of. We always start with maps. We make our own maps here, and always before visiting property, I'm going out with a map in hand, actually a series of maps in hand, so that I've got some sense of the property before I ever get there. There's a lot of free tools available to landowners to do some of the same things that we do with our maps. Google Earth's the best one. Google Earth gives you access to historical imagery for pretty much anywhere. How far back it goes will depend on where it stayed and a variety of other things, but you can go back usually a couple of decades at least, pretty much anywhere in the state. Google's done a good job of collecting all this historical imagery and making it easily accessible. And I'll show you examples of all these things, of course. Soil maps, the Web Soil Survey at that website there is a wonderful tool, much easier to use than some of the older, certainly than the older soil books and even some of the older web soil data. This has a map viewer built into it, so you can draw property and analyze the soil types that are there very simply and easily. It takes a little bit of practice to kind of understand all the tools that are there, but there's a lot of powerful tools, and I use that quite often. So very good website. Again, I'll show you a brief example of that. Topo maps, hard to replace a topo map for getting a lay of the land. USGS has these available online for viewing, and so you can go in and actually pull a topo map for any property, any area, get a sense of the elevation and how steep it is, how fast it changes, what the major features are. That can tell you quite a bit as well. And so those topo maps are always one of the few maps that we've got when we're out in the field. Tell you quite a bit. After the maps, you've got to get on the ground. All this starts with being on site and actually looking at the property. So your eyes and your feet are some of the most useful tools. You got to look at the plants, not just what types of plants are there, but what's the structure of those plants. Look at the soil. Look for any potential issues, erosion issues. The soil maps are great, but they're pretty coarse. They don't drill down to the level of a small property or even some larger properties. They're built at a very large scale, and so getting on the ground and actually seeing what condition the soil's in is irreplaceable. The artifacts, I'll explain that a little bit later, but there's some things that are just really evident that immediately tell you what the prior use was. Things like piles of rocks from bulldozing or old brush piles. And I'll talk a little bit more about those later as well. And the landforms. Topo maps are great, but unless you're really experienced at reading them, you cannot replace actually getting on the ground and seeing how the land actually lays. These are all forms of qualitative assessment. And that's important because they're value judgments. They're not numbers. You're not really putting numbers to any of this stuff. It's not something you can easily take and compare to any other property. For instance, if I go out and make these judgments, my assessment may be a little bit different than yours, but you or I can take it and compare multiple properties using these same metrics. So I can look at two properties and make these comparisons based on these value judgments. So it's not great for comparing lots of properties or getting real general, but it is for a single property. It can be very useful. Ears, you can't replace talking to the people that have lived there and that have worked the land. So talking to the neighbors, talking to the previous owners or the current owners of the property. What have they actually done? What have they been doing? What types of management have they been implementing? What do they see? That's hard to get from either of these other two places. That history is really important if you have access to it. If you can talk to those folks and learn more about it, that's a very fast way to pick up a lot of history, and can help confirm some of the things you might see using these other tools. And there are actually some apps available for some of this stuff. AgriLife's got a wonderful one for those of you interested in quail management. Their Northern Bobwhite Habitat Evaluation app, which you can find on iTunes, is a wonderful tool that gets you actually something you can compare from property to property. You're going to get some numbers, a score that you can use to compare to what we know about quail needs. And so that's a much more specific tool than these others I'm talking about, but a very useful one for those of you who are interested in Northern Bobwhite management. So we'll start with maps. This is a Google Earth screenshot. I took this one to show you that historical imagery function. If you're in Google Earth, you can click on the historical imagery button. It's up on the top toolbar, and you'll see a slider like the one circled here in red in the upper left-hand corner. This slider is set. It's hard to read, but it does say 1995, 1/8/1995 up there in the corner. And that's the earliest imagery available for this particular site, for this property. So I first visited this property in about 2005, and I could immediately go back and see 20 years back before I ever got there and see what's happened from the air over the last 20 years. Very, very useful to give me some idea of what changes have occurred on this property over the last 20 years. And you can scroll forward in time. And as you get closer generally to the present, you're going to see a much more frequent imagery. There's a lot of places where imagery is updated every year or every couple of years now. When I started, it was maybe every 5 years at the best, sometimes 10 years before you got fresh imagery. So we live in a wonderful time for seeing land from the air. Now this property, it's the same property that I just showed you on that Google Earth screenshot, but we did a project on this property where we actually dug up some very old historical imagery. This imagery is available, but it's not readily available online. You've got to go through TNRIS, the Texas Natural Resources Information Service, to order this stuff. There's typically a cost associated with it, but we dug back and found they had imagery back to 1945 from this particular site. So we got to go back 50 plus years and see what's changed. So very, very interesting study in how this land has changed over time. And we're really able to find something from almost every decade up to the present. But I've got a sample for you here. And you can see very obviously from 45 to 68, there was extensive clearing done. Extensive clearing of ash juniper cedar on this property. That's very, very evident. Most of this clearing, we got a picture from the 50s. Most of the clearing happened between 45 and 53 or so, and continued up to the 60s. And so that in and of itself tells you when you get on the ground that a lot of this land used to be cleared. You can see by 1996 on the far right there, a lot of it had regrown. A lot of the property had recovered, regrown from that previous clearing. And so it looks very, very different today than it did a few decades ago. But that signature, again, the evidence of that past clearing, even though it's been growing for decades since, is still there. And I'm going to demonstrate that. If you look at that little red star there, that spot, you can see that in 68 it was cleared. There was a strip that was cleared through there. And by 96 it had almost completely grown up. And so that's evident on the ground in a picture like this. This is that spot, that little red star. And this was from about 2005. So you can see there's still a small clearing. This is along a road, so the road was kept clear. But when I got there, and I didn't have the advantage of this imagery when I first visited this property, and but I knew just from looking at this that it had some history of prior clearing, and that's evident in the structure of the vegetation and the type of plants that are there. So you can see it's almost, in the foreground at least, it's almost solid cedar, solid ash juniper. This is a cedar break. There's almost no other hardwoods in there. There may be a scattered live oak tucked in there, but solid cedar, all about the same age. Notice the height, the structure, except for the ones here in the foreground in the clearing, all about the same size and structures. They're all about the same age. So that tells me this got cleared all at once and then essentially left to regrow. Probably, I also knew this property had a history of fairly heavy grazing, and so had been continuously grazed, no brush management maintenance done, and this is the kind of structure you get back when those sorts of management actions happen. And so I suspected, had a good sense that this area, a lot of this property had been cleared sometime in the past, probably, my guess was 30 years prior. And those historical images, when I finally saw them years later, confirmed all that. So the web soil survey, this is a screenshot here. There's lots of different things you can do with this. So that's a whole other topic, I think, in and of itself, is how to use this web soil survey. But this gives you a sense of what you can do. You can draw in a property boundary. That's that light blue line. And the website will clip out those soil types for that boundary and tell you how many acres is each, how much of the area is covered by that. And then you can go into these other tabs, the Soil Data Explorer here, and actually generate a lot of useful information from productivity. How much vegetation are these soils going to produce? What are they suitable for? Are they good for planting? Are they good for construction purposes? Lots of information available here on the web soil survey. Basically everything that's in the soil surveys, but much, much easier to generate and specific to whatever site you want to draw in. So wonderful tool. I encourage you to play with this on your property or on a property you're thinking about purchasing potentially and seeing what you can learn. And again, this is coarse information. It's a pretty broad area. These soils, those lines are not going to be precise when you get actually on the ground, but it gives you a really good overview and gives you some sense of what activities are suitable and in what areas and what you actually might be able to expect out of a property. Topo maps. This is a USGS topographic map. These are the ones you can get on that website I pointed out earlier. And again, very, very useful for getting topography, elevations, what's the slope like, how steep is it, what are the major landforms. You can see, major ravines here, high ridge tops here. Tells you a lot about what to expect. The aspect, the direction the slope faces tells you a lot. These northern facing slopes here tend to be cooler and moister, so they tend to support different vegetation than these drier south facing slopes here on the other side of the ridge. And so that can, if you know how to read them, can tell you a lot as well. One thing I want to point out is that if you compare this to that 1953 imagery from this property, it matches very closely. These green areas on a topo map are typically trees, tall vegetation. The white areas, like this, are typically open, grassy areas, not many trees. So that's how they color-coded those when they built these topo maps. And if you looked at this and didn't know when it was from, you might expect a lot more open areas on this property when you visit. But this topo map matches very closely to the 1953 aerial imagery, almost identical, which tells you this topo map was made sometime around in the 1950s. And while the topography doesn't change much in that time, that's still going to be fairly accurate. The vegetation certainly can change quite a bit. And I actually discovered on that website that the topo map is dated from the 50s, and so if you were just using that, they can one, they might fool you a little bit, but two, this in and of itself is a bit of a historical image, and can tell you that, again, this area, that area there, this area, this slope used to be cleared at one time. It's much more heavily vegetated now. So this gives you a picture, even without getting that historical imagery, tells you quite a bit. There's more information there than just elevation and topography. So when you get on the ground, what do? You've got your maps and you're out on the ground. And this is a kind of an overview of the thought process I go through when I'm looking at property. And I'll take you through a few steps. And this is generally how I try to communicate to landowners and help them understand what they've got. And I should point out that it really depends on your goals for the property. Whether any of these conditions, any of these things I'm talking about are useful or good or bad or desirable or undesirable depend on what your goals are. And so I'm generally looking at things from a wildlife management perspective, and so that's really that's how I'm going to approach it today. It's not a judgment at all against other uses, grazing purposes, those sorts of things, home site recreational purposes, but I'm going to talk about it from a wildlife perspective today. So how does it look? What does a property look like? And there's lots of different adjectives you may come up with, but these are some common ones, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what they tell me about wildlife habitat. So if what comes to mind when you look at a property is, oh, it's park-like, or it's clean, it's manicured, those are generally not things I want to hear about a wildlife property. Those are things that are great for a park, which is what this picture is of. It's a beautiful park. Looks like a great place to go play, recreate, but this is not great wildlife habitat. There's not a lot of diversity. There's not a lot of structure. There's some nice trees for shade, but that's about it. And so this, from a wildlife perspective, not the best type of structure. So maybe great for around the home site, but I don't want to see the whole property that looks like this, unless, for instance, I'm really primarily interested in grazing livestock, and then I may want to see very open park-like habitat, because that's going to maximize my grass production. But from a wildlife perspective, generally not what I want to see first off. Brushy and rough. These are terms I use these specifically because they sound a little negative. They sound like they might be bad things, but they're terms that are used a lot. This property is really brushy. That can be a very good thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Rough sounds terrible. It's a rough property. That may be a very good thing for wildlife. And so these terms aren't immediately evident that they'd be good or bad. I use this picture in particular because this looks pretty bad. If on a property like this, and we see something with a landowner, that's going to catch their eye. This is an oak wilt center. All these live oaks are dead or dying here in this picture. And that looks like a bad thing. But from a wildlife perspective, underneath it, all what those dead live oaks has done is they've released this understory, this mid-story shrub layer. And while I don't want to see all my live oaks die from a wildlife perspective, there's a lot of diversity in the plants here. If I'm interested in deer or even songbirds, wild turkey, this low shrub cover diverse. And Colorado. This is a Yopon monoculture. The tree know that. It can become overly abundant and crowd out other so impassable can be, in some cases, indicator of okay, sorry about that. We had some technical difficulties. I think we're back now. If you missed it, I'm gonna go through this one again. So this what I see here is what comes to mind is impassable, impenetrable. Can't walk through it. Previous slide I mentioned that having that low brush cover is a good thing for wildlife, but when it gets to this point, in some cases, it can be too much. This is a monoculture, a solid stand, almost of Yopon. Almost nothing else underneath there except Yopon. The tree canopy's in good shape. It's nice and diverse. Lots of different hardwoods and eastern red cedar, but this understory, the shrub layer is almost solid Yopon, and that's going to require probably some management action to thin that out, reduce that, and try to get some more diversity. And so just having lots of brush in and of itself may be a good thing, maybe a bad thing, depends on your goals, of course, but when we get to the point where it's impassable, in a lot of cases, that tells me something else other than just brushy and rough. So on to, I think orderly when I see something like this. This is what a professor of mine at Texas Tech would call a parallel forest. All the trees are in nice straight rows. They line up, this one in particular is overstocked. It's an old pine plantation that never got thinned. And so it's overstocked, it's a nice neat rows, and the canopy's so thick that all you've got really on the ground is a bunch of pine needles, pine duff, and an occasional Arkansas yucca or two, and that's about it. And this is not good wildlife habitat. This is a desert almost for wildlife. There's really no resources here other than some shade. Not much else going on here. So again, this orderly, which kind of aligns with the neat and manicured slide that we started with, indicates some issues for wildlife management. It's going to require some work, some timber management, and to get it into shape where it's providing good habitat. Now these are terms I love to hear, love to use. Diverse, shrubby, wild. These are terms that to me indicate good conditions generally for wildlife. This property has a lot going on. There's a lot going on in this picture, and it may be hard for you to see, but look at just the different shades of green you've got in that shrub layer underneath those oaks. Different shades, different leaf shapes, lots of different kinds of plants in this understory. There's some open areas where you've got some beautiful little blue stem. That's what all that grass is here in the front on the left. Good native grass. So there's some wildflowers, forbs down in the lower left corner you can see poking up. So lots of plant diversity, lots of different kinds of plants, and lots of different types of structure. There's low shrubby stuff, there's taller stuff, good for browsing. There's low ground cover, nesting cover on the ground, and it looks kind of wild. But this is good wildlife habitat. This hits a lot of the buttons for what I want to see from a good wildlife property. So It's going to look very different depending on which part of the state you're in. That doesn't mean the same thing in every part of the state, but certainly these terms can apply kind of across the board. So we get down after that general condition. We talk about the plants themselves. What's dominant? What are the primary plants? We don't have to identify everything that's there, but or even the species sometimes, but think about the categories of plants: trees, shrubs, grasses, and weeds, or forbs. These are just broadleaf ground cover that's not grasses. Right? That's our wildflowers and the things that we really think of as weeds as well. But all four of these classes of plants are important. You want to find, in any case, almost you're going to want to find some examples of each of these groups. And you want to have different kinds of plants in each of these groups as well. This picture gives you a good example. The tree layer is pretty much all live oak. That's typical in the plateau. You get a lot of properties that are solid live oak, not a lot of other hardwoods present, but well scattered. There's some shrub, a little bit of shrub growth underneath them. So you've got some shrub layer tucked underneath these oak mottes. Here and here, a little bit of shrub growth. So that's a good thing to see. I've got that layer. I don't have a lot of, I got some, but not a lot of little shrubby cedar and things like that might be a problem for me. Not a lot of prickly pear that might become overly abundant. I've got good grass cover here. These nice native bunch grasses. There's some muley, and there's some side oats grama in here. So I've got some good grasses, good grass cover, relatively continuous. There is some bare ground in here. That's okay. Bare ground's not all bad. That's a place for those weeds to grow. And so I've got all four classes in here, and I'm starting to look at what's the dominant plant in each, and do I have something from each of those four groups? And I'm going to go into that in a little more detail. This is a very different picture. What's dominant here? Well, in this open area, there's only one thing. It's Bermuda grass. This is a clearing that was made in this pine forest and planted in Bermuda grass. And so it's dominant. And typically when you plant Bermuda grass, that's what you want. You're doing it for grazing purposes, generally. This landowner actually wasn't interested in it for grazing purposes. He just thought it was something good to plant to get on the ground and get it covered. And it did a good job of that. Good job at holding soil in place, but not a lot of diversity here for wildlife. This is really only dominated by grass. There aren't many weeds in here, which again, if I'm grazing it or hanging it, that's a good thing. But not many weeds, really no shrub layer whatsoever until you get back to the edge of the forest here in the far background. You get back into some sort of mid-story shrub layer there. You can see under here it's been cleared completely, so not much shrub layer. So really the only dominant plant here, you've got some loblolly pines and a bunch of Bermuda grass. So much less diverse than that prior picture. What's dominant here? Again, you've got some trees, some live oak here, and lots of weeds. Specifically, two kinds. You got ragweed here and broomweed. That's really all that you've got in this picture. Those are the dominant plants. There's not much else. There's really not many grasses at all. Not much of a shrub layer at all underneath these oaks or anywhere else. And so, again, very different picture than that first one I showed you. But making these notes and making these observations, that starts to give you an overall picture of what you've got on your property and what the challenges might be. What are you missing? What's dominant here? Obviously, it's prickly pear. That's hard to miss in this particular case. Lots and lots of prickly pear. You do have some other shrubs here on the edges, some good tree cover along those edges, but lots and lots of prickly pear. And this was true throughout the property. And keep that in mind. These are snapshots of small areas, but you want to get a sense across the entire property to answer these questions fully. So this tells me, the dominance of prickly pear here, again, tells me something about the past use of this place. This property was, in fact, it had been heavily grazed for a long, long time. This area in particular was probably cleared. They had been, shredded subsequently. And that prickly pear, in that, along with overgrazing, it just spread and started to dominate the property. And so very, very thick. This is going to be obviously a management concern if it's something that's true throughout the property. In addition to what's dominant, you got to think about what you don't have, what's missing. I think it's fairly obvious in this one. You've got mesquite, so you got some trees, shrubs, you got some prickly pear, there's some shrub growth under the mesquites, a little bit, not a whole lot, but there is no ground cover at all in this picture. There's no grass, there's maybe one or two scattered little, sad little weeds popping up, no ground cover. This is bare soil with mesquite and prickly pear and some other mixed brush. And so lots of things missing from this one. And each of those components, I'm going to want to find a way to encourage and replace at some point. So that's a very, very important piece is missing from this picture. Often it's a little more subtle, as in this one. What's missing here? This looks pretty nice. Got good trees, got good low shrub cover here, and throughout the back end, along the tree cover, lots of green on the ground, so good ground cover. But what's hard to tell from this picture is that there's virtually no grass on this property. All of this ground cover is composed of forbs, weeds, all herbaceous forbs. So almost no grass. As a matter of fact, it was hard to find grass even tucked back on the edges of these shrubs or in other protected areas. And again, not very obvious from the picture, but when you get on the ground, you'll start to see that. Just an absence of one of these components. If you just looked at this, you might think this is in great shape, no major issues here, but when you get on the ground, you can see quickly that there's some signs of really heavy grazing pressure on a property like this. So in addition to what's there, what components you've got, what about diversity? How many different kinds of plants do you have? Even if you can't identify them, just noticing that you've got, is it 5 different plants you can see? Is it 10 or 20 different plants you can see? That tells you quite a bit and lets you compare. I've been on a lot of properties where, I might find, particularly in the trees and the shrubs, I might only have 3 or 4 different species. That's a bad sign. There should be lots and lots of different kinds of plants on a healthy property. And so in addition to the types of plants, what about the structure? And what about the different heights, different levels of plants that you're seeing? Is it all just trees and grass, like that Bermuda grass clearing I showed you in the pine forest? Or is there lots of different structure like you see here? There's low ground cover, vines, forbs, there's a mid-story shrub cover, there's lots of trees, vines going into the trees as well. So lots of structure here, as well as lots of diversity, which is typical. If you notice this beautyberry in the front, this is obviously East Texas as well. Tends to be lots of vegetation like this, lots of diversity naturally. But you can get cases like that impassable slide I showed you where Yopon takes over and you don't see this kind of diversity. Might have good structure, but not lots of diversity of plants. So the structure is something that I find people just don't think about as much. So I want to talk a little bit specifically about structure and how to gauge it just really roughly, quickly as you're first being introduced to a property. Or if you're looking at it in a different way for the first time. So low, high, in between, look at various heights. You've actually got to kind of put yourself at various heights to see what you can see. These 3 pictures were taken standing in the exact same spot. Starting on the left, that was at basically ground level, moving up to about chest height, and then as high as I could reach, 7.5 feet up, 8 on my tippy toes maybe, but that's the height there. You could even get on a ladder and look at it a little higher if you wanted to, but you can see very different pictures at 3 different heights, and these aren't even that far apart. This is just as far as I could bend down and reach up. So very different structure, and looking at it from these 3 levels can give you a different perspective. You can see On the far left, that lowest shot, there is some cover right here in front of me, but you can see pretty far back into this at that ground level. And that's a level that a lot of certainly smaller wildlife are operating on. So not as much cover down low as you would think if you were looking at that middle picture. Looks like it's very dense and very difficult to see through there. And so different perspective when you get down on the ground. Just watch out for fire ant beds. This top structure, you can see that shrub layer kind of continues up. You can start to see a little more into the canopy of the trees above you, but a good structure from that middle and upper level, but much more visible down low than you might suspect just looking at a normal standing height. Similar situation here, a little different habitat to give you a different perspective on it. Ground level on the left, chest height or so in the middle, and as high as I could reach on the right. And you can see down low here, we've got some low grass cover, and that really obscures that visibility down low. When you stand up at chest height, that becomes, you can see, 30, 40 yards back right away, instantly. So different structure in the middle. You're missing that in this particular spot. That shrub layer is not obscuring that view at chest height. And you can see the difference here between the middle and the right hand, the chest height and the 7, 8 feet height isn't that different. You're not seeing much else there. So that tells you that those 3 layers of structure, not a lot of change from middle to high, but very, very different when you get down at that ground level. Other thing to consider about plants is not just the physical structure, but the age structure. How old are the plants that you're seeing? And we tend to focus on, I've got lots of great big trees, got lots of diversity in my big trees, lots of different kinds of hardwoods, lots of different oaks, but we don't think about a lot of times how those big trees, those old trees get replaced eventually, because everything dies at some point. All those old trees have to have young ones coming up in order to replace them at some point. And if you're in the Everest Plateau, you know that a young Spanish oak, a young red oak, can be very difficult to find. And what that means is when all those nice big red oaks die, there's nothing to replace them. And in the hill country, in the Everest Plateau, that's generally because deer are eating them all. And but that's a real management concern. It's a long-term management concern, next generation kind of management concern generally. But an important one. If one of the things you love about a property are those nice big hardwoods, you got to think about the young trees that are going to replace them. This is a picture actually from near San Antonio, and I took it because I was astonished. I hadn't seen anything like this in a long time. This is a stand of young Spanish oak, all different ages and good. Some of them above head height, well protected. Plenty big enough to keep deer from killing them, and there's some young seedlings coming up as well. This was a beautiful sight to behold because this property had a lot of large Spanish oaks, but it also had this younger age class, these teenagers and children that were going to eventually replace that older generation. That's really important. So think about that. If you take nothing else away, think about the age structure of your plants. It's a longer-term thought process, but one I find that it's easy to overlook on a lot of properties. Plants can tell you a lot about what's happened in the past from a grazing perspective as well. This is actually an ash juniper. This is a cedar tree. When I first saw it, I didn't know what to make of it because I hadn't seen a structure like this before. This was many, many years ago. And while the property may look relatively lightly grazed now, may not look like there's a lot of heavy grazing going on. There may be lots of other shrubs. There may be lots of ground cover. This structure tells me that at some point in the past, there was really intensive browse pressure on this plant. Usually goats for something like this. Cows usually aren't browsing on cedar trees, but I've seen this structure in old goat pastures many times since then. And this is an old structure, and it may tell me, it may have been 10, 15, 20 years ago, but there was some pretty intensive goat grazing, at least in this spot. If I find a lot of these on a property, I know it's pretty intensively goated in the past. And so sometimes this really may fall in the artifact category, which I'll talk about in a bit, but the pressure, the animal browse pressure, the consumption pressure on these plants, if they look like hedges that you'd have in your yard, that's a sign of pretty intensive use. Most plants don't grow to look like a hedge. Protected areas and fence lines are very useful comparison points for you. So don't just look at the property that you're evaluating. Look at neighboring properties. Look at areas, small areas on the property that maybe are treated a little bit differently than the property as a whole for whatever reason. And I'll explain that. This is a property, again, this is out in Kerr County. You can see, we'll apply our tools here. What's dominant? Live oak here, lots of good grass cover, mostly cool seasons in this case, but either way, got lots of good grass cover. There's some weeds in there. That's a good sign as well. Not a lot of shrub cover though. I'm kind of missing that middle layer, so there's, you can see 100 yards back through those oaks if you just bend down a little bit, and so kind of missing that middle layer. Not much from that shrub component here. But if I step right outside the fence, this is 50 feet away from that last picture, right outside the fence. This property happened to be high fence, and this was just outside it. Same soil, same habitat, same potential all the way around, but very different structure. And this tells me what could have been, what should have been on the other side of that fence, but wasn't present. And that tells me that there's a lot of animal pressure on the other side of that fence. In this case, it happened to be a lot of exotics as well as white-tailed deer, just putting a lot of pressure on the property. But I could instantly see it wasn't that the plants weren't there, it's that they just couldn't grow fast enough to outpace the animals eating them. So lots of diversity here in this picture. There's 6 or 7 different shrubs there, some vines as well. Beautiful wildlife habitat here, lots of diversity. And you notice it's not impenetrable. It's not that I've lost that openness to the habitat, but I've got a lot more structure, a lot more diversity here. And that's almost always a good thing. Fence line contrasts. If you ever see me talk, you'll see me use a lot of these. They're wonderful tools because, again, same soil type, same potential, very different responses, very different habitats on each side of this fence because there have been very different management decisions made. And so if perhaps I'm evaluating this property on the left and get on it and I'm looking at it, again, I'm seeing not a lot of grass cover, not a lot of weeds either here. Really not much in the way of shrub cover back here either. Mostly just live oaks and some kind of scraggly ground cover down there. But I know, looking right across the fence, that I've got a lot of potential for this property. Look at all this little blue stem. This, again, very, very desirable native grass to have. Great for quail. It's good for grazing, too. And good in general for soil and water health. And so I know I've got the potential to do that right on the other side of this fence. There's no reason I can't. It's just a matter of adjusting management strategy. So that's very, very encouraging. And I know that I can probably do this without spending a whole bunch of money on reseeding, buying a bunch of seed. The seeds are here. The seeds are in the soil. You just got to give them a chance to take hold. So always like to see something like this. It's very encouraging. Another example here, but with that shrub layer, that brush layer, either side of a high fence. You notice there's really not much of a shrub layer on the left, fairly abundant on the right, and lots of diversity, lots of good structure, low cover for things like quail, for things like, this is a great site for a turkey to lay a nest, great for songbirds as well, small mammals. Very, very good structure on the right, and the only difference is the deer can't get to the ones on the right. Something as simple as that. But I know these shrubs are here. I know they're on the property. I know that it's got the potential to produce them, and that's encouraging. This is a little enclosure that I found on a property I was looking at. So still the same property, but it had been pinned off for whatever reason. I'm not sure exactly. Wasn't a feeder pen because it was too high, but a small little enclosure. And what was encouraging on this property is the plants inside the enclosure were very similar to the ones outside. And what that told me was, even if you protect the small area, I'm still getting lots of good growth outside. So I'm probably not overstocked with livestock or with white-tailed deer. I'm getting good similar growth. I can't really tell the difference between the inside and the outside. And that means that things are in pretty good balance. That's a good sign. So these little old protected areas can be very useful. You can do the same thing with a big clump of prickly pear. That's a small protected area, often protected from cows grazing in it and other disturbances. And so those natural exposures can be useful as well. Talk about soil erosion. That's certainly something to look at. It can indicate some potential problems for you. Gully erosion. That's these bigger, deeper areas. Rill erosion, which is really small gullies. Lots of little tiny gullies, kind of like this here. Sheet erosion, which is broad erosion over a larger area that's harder to see because you can't see when a whole layer has been removed very easily. But the pedestals, if you find a structure like this, and you look at this little clump of grass here, you'll notice it's sitting above the rest of the ground. It's elevated as if on a pedestal here. And that's an indication, if you see that across a large area, that's an indication of that sheet erosion. There's been a whole layer of soil that's been washed away, and it's not evident because there's not a defined channel, but it's an indicator of a serious problem. We've lost a lot of productive soil potentially, but the roots of that grass held that one in place. And then compaction, which I've got some pictures of as well, can be harder to see, but can be important for understanding how to manage an area. So gullies can be they're really obvious. It's not hard to see when you've got a gully, especially one like this. The important thing here is that gullies like this don't fix themselves. That's not a problem that's going to go away on its own. No matter what management you implement in the surrounding lands, you're going to have a problem here. So it's going to require some significant repair, significant input to fix an issue like this. But you know you've got an issue with runoff coming down, in this case, coming down this road. And so you can do some things to, and should do some things to fix that, but you're going to have to come back and repair that as well. So an indicator of a pretty significant runoff issue here when you see a gully like this, and that warrants some investigation. What's causing this problem? This is the best example I've got of sheet erosion outside of those pedestals. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to see because it's not a three-dimensional picture. But if you were on the ground here, what you'd see is that the level of the ground on the left is actually about 4 inches below the level of the ground on the right. That's how much soil has washed away from this property on the left. And the only thing holding in place is this fence and the fact that there's some vegetation on the right, hasn't been grazed as heavily, so that vegetation's kind of held it in place. There may be also, once that starts to happen, an effect where you're getting water channeled down this fence line, and it's accelerating that erosion. But this sheet erosion is pretty, there's no defined channel here, but lost a lot of soil on this left-hand side. And you might not notice that if you didn't have the right-hand side to compare that to. Compaction. Compaction's that's indicated when you get an area that perhaps you're on this property. It's not being grazed very heavily. There should be lots of grass. Perhaps we're not in a drought, and you get to an area where there's just no grass growing. There's no ground cover. You can see some ground cover underneath these shrubs, underneath the mesquite here, but there's no ground cover in these open areas at all. That's an indication of soil compaction. That soil is compressed and compacted so that even when it rains, that water runs off it like concrete. It just can't penetrate into the ground and do any good. It's running off, and that's going to cause more erosion, but it's also makes it a really slow recovery process for plants. unless you get something like a mesquite in there that can get a hold and start to put some roots in the ground and start to get water and moisture into the soil so that other plants can take advantage of it. There are some management prescriptions for compacted soil. You run a disc over it, or an aerator in South Texas, run an aerator over it, break that crust up and get that water into the ground, and you'll start to see some recovery pretty quickly. Another example of soil compaction, again, pretty good. There's some ground cover underneath these shrubs where they've got other root systems to help get water into the soil and get that soil some structure. But outside there, in the rest of this area, that soil just, the water can't penetrate, plants just can't get started. They will eventually, they'll eventually come back, but it's a very slow process and something you probably want to speed up. So it's going to take some effort and some input to recover these areas. You can't just throw seed on it and expect it to grow. You can't just rest it and expect it to recover quickly. There's going to be some other prescriptions here that you'll have to take. On to artifacts. Stumps are classic artifacts. This is a picture I used at the beginning, and I find these all the time. I do a lot of work, of course, in the hill country, in the Edwards Plateau, and I might not have historical imagery for whatever reason. I might not have much of a history. It might be a property that's just purchased, and they don't know any of the history of the property. Perhaps the structure of the plants is such that it's not evident that there's been extensive clearing in the past. But these stumps can tell me another story. Sometimes one that goes much deeper than just the plants themselves. As you all know, cedar doesn't rot very quickly. That's why we use it for fence posts. And so these old axe-cut stumps, and that's what these are, axe-cut stumps, and these were everywhere on the property. This is an indication that this used to be some very large cedar here that was cleared a long time ago, because nobody clears cedar with an axe anymore. And if you do, I'd like to talk to you. That's a lot of work. It's hard work with a chainsaw, much less an axe. But it was probably chopped for clearing for range or for charcoal, all the other reasons that cedar would have been cleared. But there was a pretty substantial cedar woodland here at one time, long ago, and these are the artifacts that are left. And so you can find things like that that give you a really deep picture of the past. Burn scars are another nice one. This one was fairly evident. You can see, of course, the dead trees here in the foreground that indicated something had happened. But down the line, it may not be as obvious. Those trees fall over, you can't see them, it's not as apparent. And this burn had kind of gone through this whole area, come from another property and across this property in a line and strip. And so while it's evident now, once these trees fall down, the question is, will there still be some signature left? And what you can't see in the picture is that the habitat on either side of this burn scar is very different. It is, as you can imagine, dominated by cedar, ash juniper, with some live oaks, lots of ash juniper, and in this burn area, you've got all these shrubs coming up. You've got wahio and knife leaf condalia coming up in this burn scar. So this area is going to look very different for many years, even once those dead trees may no longer be evident. And so you'd be driving through the area and all of a sudden the vegetation would change very quickly. That's an indication, even if you don't know it's a burn scar, it's an indication something happened here in the past to change this. Can give you a picture of the history, what's happened on this property in the past. This is another example, that very stark change there in the grass. And even if you don't recognize them, you can see that color change right there across the middle of the picture. On the left-hand side and in the foreground, that's mostly King Ranch blue stem, almost completely. And in the background on the right side, that's almost solid stem, a little blue stem, an excellent native grass. And so something happened here. The grasses typically don't grow in straight lines like that. And that tells me that something went on. When I noticed that, it caught my attention, and I asked the ranch manager, what happened? Something's going on here. Did y'all Did y'all clear an area? Did you reseed this? What happened? Turns out it was just an accidental fire that ripped through here. And you can see where the fire stopped. It's where the little blue stem stops. So the area that got burned, the whole area used to be King Ranch blue stem. The area that got burned, the timing was just right apparently, and it came back strong in that beautiful red little blue stem. And that's without reseeding. That plant was there waiting to grow. So that, again, tells you a lot about the potential for this property to produce native grasses and the benefits of fire as well. So to wrap all that up, these are things, because that's a lot of information, it's a lot of words, and think about these questions. If you're going out to look at a property, maybe looking at your property, maybe looking for a different perspective on it, or you're looking at a property you're thinking about buying, think about what's the potential. What do the soils tell me the potential is? What can I do? What makes sense? What shouldn't I do is often as important. The topography can tell you a lot about the potential to meet your goals. Location, past land use, and that's a lot of what we talked about today was what are the signs of past land use? What's happened to this property, and what can I get out of that to inform my management? What's the current condition? Plants. Don't think about just the types of plants, but start at that upper level, trees, shrubs, grasses, and weeds. And then how many different kinds of plants in each group. And then also that structure, low, medium, and high. Do I have all those levels scattered throughout the property? And again, that's how much of it you want is going to depend on your goals. What's the condition of the soils? Are they in good shape? Do they look healthy? Are they compacted? What sorts of things might I need to do to get the soils in good shape, or do they need any attention? What are the potential management issues? What's going to cost me if I purchase this property, or if I'm thinking about doing a lot of work? What's going to cost the most? Where are my dollars going to have to go? Is it major erosion issues I need to correct? Is it brush management? What are the sorts of things that are really going to impact my ability to reach my goals most? So that's about it. And I want to thank everybody again for joining us. Sorry for the technical difficulties. And if you have any questions, of course, feel free to call me. I want to thank TWA for hosting these webinars. I listen to them all the time. I find them very informative, very useful, and love the series. A great way to spend a lunch hour. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you next time.
Thank you very much, Shane. I want to add, just put up in the chat window that there is a link to all of our future webinars. So if you are interested in tuning into more of these, either live or archived, if you follow the link that I just put up in the chat window, you'll be able to find them there. I want to echo the thanks of tuning in today and hope you will join us for future webinars.